The algorithm knows what you watched at AM, what you paused on, what you rewatched, what you skipped after for seconds. It has a record of your attention that is more detailed than anything you have ever told another person. That record has a name in information architecture. It is called a behavioral profile, and the institutional system built to extract, store, and leverage the most private dimensions of human behavior for purposes of influence and compliance did not originate with Netflix or Spotify or YouTube. It was operational in Western Europe by the 13th century, administered by an institution that understood, 700 years before behavioral data science, that the person who holds your confessions holds your compliance. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how the Catholic Church's medieval confessional system developed the first documented behavioral profiling infrastructure in Western history, how that infrastructure's structural logic was transmitted into the design methodology of modern recommendation algorithms, and why the most powerful leverage point in any influence system has always been the same: not what you do in public, but what you do when you think no one is watching. The algorithm was always watching, it just used to wear different clothes. On October 5, 2021, Frances Haugen testified before the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee. She had spent 2 years as a product manager on Facebook's civic integrity team before becoming the most significant internal whistleblower in the company's history. Her testimony contained one finding that received less coverage than it deserved. Facebook's recommendation algorithm, she stated, was not optimized for user satisfaction. It was optimized for what internal documents called integrity-adjacent behaviors, a category that included content that generated high engagement through emotional distress, moral outrage, and social anxiety. The algorithm did not recommend what users enjoy. It recommended what users could not stop engaging with, despite not enjoying it. The distinction is precise. Enjoyment is a satisfied state. It produces closure. Closure ends the session. What the algorithm optimized for was the opposite of closure, a sustained state of unresolved emotional activation that kept the user inside the platform because leaving felt like abandoning an unresolved situation. That optimization objective has a structural precedent in institutional design. It is not a Silicon Valley innovation. It is a documented feature of every behavioral influence system sophisticated enough to understand the difference between satisfaction and dependency. But that is only the surface. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most consequential administrative decisions in the history of the Catholic Church, made annual confession mandatory for every Catholic in Western Christendom. The theological justification was spiritual. The institutional function was something more specific. Mandatory confession created, for the first time in Western history, a systematic infrastructure for the collection of private behavioral data at population scale. Every practicing Catholic was required, once per year at minimum, to disclose to an institutional representative the full inventory of their private transgressions, their desires, their fears, their violations of institutional norms, their relationships, their financial activities, their sexual behavior. The confessor was required to listen, to classify, and to respond with institutional guidance calibrated to the specific profile of the confessant. The Church did not call this data collection. It called it pastoral care. The functional description is more precise. It was the most comprehensive private behavioral profiling system the pre-modern world ever constructed, administered through a network of institutional representatives distributed across every populated territory in Western Europe, updated annually, and cross-referenced against a detailed taxonomy of behavioral categories, the 7 deadly sins, and their subcategories that classified human behavior with the granularity that anticipated modern psychographic segmentation by 7 centuries. This is what most historians of the confessional note as a theological development, and what institutional historians of information systems have not adequately documented as an information architecture. The confessional was a data collection terminal. The priest was a trained data collector. The penance was a behavioral intervention calibrated to the collected profile. The absolution was the incentive that ensured continued data submission. The system was self-sustaining. Thomas Tentler's 1977 Institutional History of the Medieval Confessional, Sin and Confession on the Eve of the Reformation, documents the development of increasingly sophisticated confessor manuals texts called summae confessorum that train priests in behavioral classification and intervention design. The manual specified which behavioral profiles required which interventions, how to sequence questioning to extract maximum behavioral disclosure, and how to use the information disclosed to strengthen the confessant's institutional compliance over time. These were not spiritual texts. They were operational manuals for behavioral influence systems. The summae confessorum were the first documented recommendation system training materials in Western history. They told the institutional representative what to suggest, to whom, based on what behavioral data had been collected. The logic is structurally identical to the collaborative filtering algorithms that underlie every major recommendation system today. Collect behavioral data, classify the subject into a behavioral profile, deliver content or instruction calibrated to that profile to maximize continued engagement with the institutional system. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the confessional infrastructure had been refined to a level of operational sophistication that church historians describe as the first large-scale psychological influence system in Western civilization. The Jesuit order, founded in 1540, treated the confessional as a primary instrument of geopolitical influence, using behavioral data collected in confession to identify and leverage the compliance vulnerabilities of political figures across Europe and the Americas. If you have noticed a specific moment where a platform's recommendation seemed to know something about your private behavior that you did not remember disclosing, describe it in the comments. We are mapping the specific data collection mechanisms users are becoming able to identify. Here is where the structural analysis becomes precise enough to be diagnostic. The medieval confessional and the modern recommendation algorithm share not a metaphorical resemblance, but an operational architecture. The correspondence is specific at the level of mechanism, not analogy. And mapping the correspondence reveals exactly how the contemporary system works, because the medieval one was documented with a precision that its digital successor has been careful to obscure. Wait, look at the structure again. The confessional system had 4 operational components. First, a mandatory disclosure mechanism that ensured regular data submission. Second, a trained classification system that organized disclosed behavior into standardized profile categories. Third, a calibrated recommendation engine that delivered personalized behavioral guidance based on the collected profile. Fourth, an incentive architecture absolution that made continued participation in the data collection system feel like a personal benefit rather than an institutional extraction. Every major recommendation algorithm has an equivalent of all 4 components. The disclosure mechanism is passive rather than active. Behavioral data is collected through observation of what the user does rather than what the user says, but the data collected is more comprehensive, not less, than what the confessional extracted. Netflix knows not just what you watched, but when you paused, when you skipped, when you rewound, and at what emotional valence you typically engage with specific content categories. Spotify knows your listening patterns at a temporal and contextual granularity that maps your emotional states across the day with greater precision than self-report could achieve. That is not a design choice. It is a behavioral data collection architecture, identical in objective to the confessional's mandatory disclosure requirement, more efficient, more comprehensive, and entirely invisible to the person being profiled. The classification system is the collaborative filtering engine, the algorithmic equivalent of the confessor's taxonomic training. Your behavioral data is not evaluated in isolation. It is cross-referenced against the behavioral profiles of millions of other users to identify which profile cluster you belong to, what that cluster's members have engaged with that you have not yet encountered, and what the engagement trajectory of that cluster predicts about your future behavior. The summae confessorum classified sinners into behavioral types and predicted their future transgressions based on type. The collaborative filter classifies users into behavioral clusters and predicts their future engagement based on cluster. The logic is identical. The scale is incomparable. The pattern does not stop there. The incentive architecture is the element most directly descended from the confessional model. and the most deliberately obscured in contemporary platform design. Absolution made confession feel like a personal benefit. The user submitted data, the institution processed it, the user received relief. The recommendation algorithm's equivalent is the experience of a perfectly calibrated content delivery. The user behaves, the algorithm processes, the user receives content that feels personally meaningful, unexpectedly relevant, and therefore evidence that the platform understands them. That experience of being understood is the digital equivalent of absolution. It makes continued data submission feel like a relationship rather than an extraction. The system sustains itself through the same incentive logic the confessional used for 300 years. If this investigation is worth continuing, signal it. The algorithm reads that as a vote for independent analysis. Here is the applicable lens. Next time a recommendation feels unnervingly accurate, next time a platform surfaces content that seems to know something about your private state that you did not consciously disclose, do not experience it as evidence that the platform understands you. Experience it as evidence that your behavioral profile has been matched to a cluster whose members have already made the choices the platform is about to suggest to you. You are not being understood. You are being classified. The distinction matters because understanding implies a relationship between two subjects. Classification implies a relationship between a subject and an institutional system that processes subjects. The confessional called it pastoral care. The algorithm calls it personalization. The operational architecture is the same. The power differential is the same. What is different is that the medieval confessant knew they were in a confessional. The platform user typically does not. The next layer of this investigation goes deeper into how the behavioral profile data collected by recommendation algorithms is being integrated with institutional systems outside consumer media, healthcare, insurance, financial services, and governmental compliance infrastructure, and what the integration of those behavioral profiles with institutional decision-making produces at the level of individual life outcomes. Subscribe to follow the analysis. The question is not whether the recommendation algorithm knows more about your private behavior than any institution in history has previously known about an individual. It does. The question is what an institution with that knowledge is authorized to do with it, and who is currently writing those authorization documents.